Amsterdam, 1943. A 14-year-old girl walks into a smoke-filled bar where Nazi officers are drinking, laughing, celebrating another day of occupation. She's wearing a dress that makes her look older, red lipstick carefully applied, hair styled like the women in the resistance taught her. She approaches a young German soldier, maybe 22, 23 years old, sitting alone at the corner table. She smiles. He smiles back. They talk. He thinks he's lucky. He thinks he's about to have an adventure with a Dutch girl who finds him attractive. In 1 hour, he'll be dead in the forest, a bullet in the back of his head, and she'll ride her bicycle home in time for dinner. Her name was Freddie Oversteegen, and she was one of the deadliest members of the Dutch resistance. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. She wasn't the only child doing this. Her sister Truus was 16. Their friend Hannie Schaft was 19. Together, these 3 young women killed more Nazis than most Allied soldiers, and they did it in the most cold-blooded, calculated way imaginable. This is the story they didn't teach you in school. The story that was buried for decades because it was too uncomfortable, too morally complex, too horrifying to accept. Because how do you celebrate a teenage girl who used her beauty as a weapon, who learned to flirt, to seduce, to lie, and then to kill without hesitation? The Netherlands in 1940 had been a neutral country, a place of canals and windmills and tulips, a nation that wanted nothing to do with Hitler's war. But neutrality meant nothing to the Wehrmacht. On May 10, 1940, German forces invaded, and within 5 days the Dutch army surrendered. The royal family fled to London, the government collapsed, and almost overnight, a country of 9 million people found itself under Nazi occupation. The Germans were efficient, methodical, brutal. They installed a civilian administration, led by Arthur Seyss-Inquart, an Austrian Nazi whose first priority was simple: identify, register, and eventually deport every single Jew in the Netherlands. The Dutch Jews, numbering around 140,000, suddenly found themselves trapped. No escape routes, no Allied armies coming to save them, just lists, yellow stars, and the slow, grinding machinery of genocide beginning to turn. For most Dutch citizens there was a choice: collaborate, comply, or resist. Most chose compliance. It was safer, it was easier. But some chose differently. In the city of Haarlem, just west of Amsterdam, a woman named Truus Oversteegen Menger was making a choice that would define her daughters' lives forever. She was a communist, a single mother, a woman who had already been defying conventions long before the war. When the Nazis began rounding up Jewish families, when neighbors started disappearing in the middle of the night, when the synagogues were vandalized and burned, Truus didn't look away. She opened her home. She hid Jewish children in her small apartment, moving them through underground networks, forging papers, smuggling them to safety. Her daughters, Freddie and Truus, watched their mother risk everything. They were children, yes, but they weren't naive. They saw the fear in the eyes of the Jewish families their mother sheltered. They heard the boots of German patrols in the street. They understood, perhaps better than most adults, that something monstrous was happening, and that someone had to fight back. When a resistance commander approached their mother in 1943, asking if her daughters could help, the answer wasn't immediate. The request wasn't to deliver messages or distribute underground newspapers. The request was specific, chilling, and unthinkable. They needed young women who could approach German soldiers without raising suspicion, women who could flirt, seduce, and lead these men to isolated locations, women who could kill. Freddie was 14 years old when she said yes. Her sister Truus was 16. Most American girls that age in 1943 were going to sock hops, collecting scrap metal for the war effort, writing letters to soldiers overseas. These Dutch girls were being trained to commit assassination. The resistance gave them weapons, small pistols that could be hidden in a purse or coat pocket. They taught them how to shoot, how to aim for the head or heart, how to make it quick. But more importantly, they taught them how to perform, how to laugh at a soldier's jokes, how to touch his arm just enough to make him feel desired, how to suggest a walk, somewhere private, somewhere away from the crowds. The training was psychological as much as tactical. These girls had to become actresses, playing a role so convincing that a trained soldier, a member of the most powerful military machine in Europe, would never suspect that the smiling teenager leading him into the woods was actually leading him to his execution, and they had to live with it afterward. They had to go home, eat dinner with their mother, sleep in their beds, wake up the next morning, and do it again. The missions followed a pattern, refined through repetition and necessity. Freddie or Truus would go to a bar, a cafe, sometimes a train station where German soldiers gathered. They'd make eye contact with a soldier who was alone, preferably young, preferably drunk enough to have lowered his guard but sober enough to walk. The approach was always casual, always natural. A smile. A comment about the weather, the music, anything to start a conversation. The soldier, starved for female attention in a hostile, occupied country, would almost always respond. Within minutes, she'd suggest they go somewhere quieter, somewhere they could talk without being overheard. Sometimes she'd mention a specific place, a clearing in the forest, an abandoned building, a spot by the canal. The soldier would agree, thinking he was about to get lucky, thinking this Dutch girl had been conquered just like her country. They'd walk together, her arm linked through his, chatting, laughing, playing the part perfectly, and waiting in the darkness, hidden among the trees or behind a wall, would be other members of the resistance, men with guns, men who had been waiting for this moment. The soldier would realize his mistake in the last seconds of his life, when the girl suddenly stepped away, when the shadows moved, when the first shot was fired. But sometimes there was no one waiting. Sometimes Freddie or Truus had to do it themselves. They'd walk into the forest with the soldier, and when his back was turned, when he was distracted, when he thought he was safe, they'd pull out the pistol and fire. Point blank. Execution style. Then they'd leave the body where it fell, wipe the gun clean, fix their makeup, and ride their bicycles back home through the streets of occupied Holland, just another teenage girl heading home before curfew. By the end of the war, the exact number of Germans these girls killed remains classified, hidden in Dutch intelligence archives, too sensitive to release even 80 years later. Some estimates say dozens, some say more. What we know for certain is this. Freddie Oversteegen, at 14 years old, became one of the most effective resistance fighters in Nazi-occupied Europe, and she did it using a weapon the Germans never saw coming: her youth, her innocence, her face. The Netherlands before the invasion had been a country that prided itself on tolerance, on civilization, on being above the barbarism that was consuming the rest of Europe. Dutch society was orderly, structured, built on centuries of trade and diplomacy. The idea that this small nation could be swept aside in 5 days was unthinkable to most Dutch citizens right up until the moment it happened. When the German bombers appeared over Rotterdam on May 14, 1940, and reduced the city centre to rubble in a single afternoon, killing nearly 900 civilians, the message was clear. Resistance was futile. Surrender was the only option. The Dutch military, outnumbered and outgunned, had no choice but to capitulate. Queen Wilhelmina fled to England, establishing a government in exile. But for the millions of Dutch citizens left behind, the reality was simple and brutal. They were now living in the Greater German Reich, and their lives belonged to Adolf Hitler. The occupation began with a strange sense of normalcy that made it even more sinister. The Germans didn't immediately start mass executions or deportations. They were strategic, methodical, playing the long game. German soldiers were ordered to be polite to Dutch civilians, to pay for goods in shops, to respect local customs. The Nazi administration wanted cooperation, not rebellion. They needed Dutch factories producing for the German war machine, Dutch farms feeding German soldiers, Dutch railways transporting materials to the Eastern Front. For the first year, many Dutch citizens convinced themselves that if they kept their heads down, if they followed the rules, if they didn't cause trouble, they could survive the occupation relatively unscathed. This was a miscalculation that would cost over 100,000 Dutch lives, because while the surface remained calm, underneath, the machinery of the Holocaust was being assembled piece by piece. Jewish citizens were required to register. Then they were forbidden from certain professions. Then they were banned from public spaces. Then they were forced to wear yellow stars. Then they were rounded up and sent east to camps with names that meant nothing yet: Westerbork, Auschwitz, Sobibor. By 1943, when Freddie Oversteegen walked into her first bar to seduce her first Nazi soldier, the Netherlands had already lost most of its Jewish population. Over 100,000 Dutch Jews would eventually be murdered in the death camps, the highest percentage of any Western European country. This wasn't because the Dutch were more anti-Semitic than their neighbors. It was because the Nazi administration in the Netherlands was horrifyingly efficient, and because Dutch record-keeping, that famous Dutch bureaucratic precision, made it easy to identify every single Jewish citizen. The population registers that had been created for administrative convenience became death lists. The civil servants who had simply been doing their jobs found themselves complicit in genocide. And the average Dutch citizen, the ones who weren't hiding Jews, who weren't joining the resistance, who were just trying to survive, found themselves living in a society where their neighbors disappeared in the night and no one dared to ask questions. This was the world that created Freddie Oversteegen. A world where normal morality had collapsed, where childhood had become a luxury no one could afford, where a 14-year-old girl could be asked to commit murder and have it be considered not just acceptable, but necessary. Her mother, Truus, had already been radicalized by what she witnessed. The families she hid in her apartment weren't abstract concepts or statistics. They were real people, parents clutching children, elderly grandparents who couldn't understand why their country had turned against them, teenagers like her own daughters who should have been worrying about school and friends, but instead were worrying about survival. Every time Truus successfully smuggled a Jewish child to safety, she saved one life. But she could see the mathematics of genocide unfolding around her. One family saved wasn't enough when thousands were being deported every week. The resistance networks needed to do more than hide people. They needed to fight back, to make the occupation costly, to kill Germans. When the resistance commander approached the Oversteegen family with his proposal, he was explicit about what he needed. The resistance had men who could sabotage railways, who could blow up bridges, who could engage in direct combat with German patrols. But these operations were becoming increasingly difficult as the Nazi security apparatus tightened its grip. The Gestapo was everywhere, informants were everywhere, and any young man of fighting age was automatically suspect. What the resistance needed was someone who could move freely, who wouldn't be stopped and searched, who could get close to German soldiers without raising any alarms. They needed women. Young women. Girls, really. Girls who could exploit the one weakness the Wehrmacht hadn't accounted for in their occupation strategy. The arrogance and loneliness of young soldiers far from home, surrounded by a hostile population, desperate for female attention. It was a weapon the Germans never saw coming, and it would prove devastatingly effective. Freddie Oversteegen wasn't supposed to be a killer. She was supposed to be a child. Before the war, her life had been difficult but normal for a working-class Dutch girl in the 1930s. Her parents had divorced, an uncommon and scandalous thing in that era, leaving her mother Truus to raise two daughters alone in Haarlem. They were poor, struggling to make ends meet, living in a small apartment that barely had enough space for 3 people, let alone the Jewish refugees they would later hide. Freddie attended school, helped her mother with chores, played with her older sister Truus in the streets of their neighborhood. She was artistic, creative, the kind of girl who drew pictures and told stories. In another timeline, in a world without war, she might have become a teacher, an artist, a mother. Instead, she became an assassin. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually, through a series of small decisions and exposures to horrors that no child should witness. When her mother began hiding Jewish families, Freddie saw firsthand what terror looked like. She saw children her own age trembling at every sound, convinced the Gestapo was coming for them. She saw parents trying to explain to their children why they couldn't go outside, why they had to be silent, why their entire world had shrunk to a single hidden room. The decision to join the resistance wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There was no grand speech, no moment of revelation. It was simply a question asked and answered. The resistance commander, a man whose real name has been lost to history, sat down with Truus Oversteegen Menge and explained what he needed. He needed girls who could pass as innocent, who could approach German soldiers without suspicion, who could lead them into traps. He needed girls who were willing to kill. He looked at Freddie and her sister and asked if they would do it. The pause that followed that question must have felt eternal. A mother being asked if her daughters could become murderers. Daughters being asked if they were willing to take human lives. But in the context of 1943 Netherlands, in a country where 100,000 Jews had already been deported to death camps, in a world where morality itself had been twisted beyond recognition, the answer came quickly. Yes. Both girls said yes. Their mother said yes. And in that moment, Freddie Oversteegen's childhood ended completely. The training began immediately in safe houses scattered across Haarlem and Amsterdam, locations that changed constantly to avoid detection. The resistance couldn't afford formal training facilities or lengthy preparation periods. Everything had to be learned quickly, efficiently, in the gaps between German patrols. Freddie learned how to handle a pistol, how to load it, how to aim, how to fire without hesitation. The guns were small, easily concealed, often British-made weapons that had been parachuted in by the Royal Air Force or stolen from German armories. She practiced shooting at makeshift targets in basements, learning to hit center mass, learning that hesitation would get her killed. But the physical training was only part of the equation, perhaps the easier part. The psychological training was far more complex and far more disturbing. Freddie had to learn how to lie convincingly, how to flirt without revealing her disgust, how to make a German soldier believe she was attracted to him when every fiber of her being wanted to spit in his face. She had to learn how to compartmentalize, how to separate the smiling girl in the bar from the girl who would pull the trigger in the forest. Her first mission came just weeks after she agreed to join the resistance. The details have never been fully disclosed, buried in classified Dutch intelligence files that remain sealed even today. But the basic framework is known. Freddie dressed in clothes borrowed from older resistance members, applied makeup to look older than 14, and walked into a bar in Haarlem where German soldiers were known to gather. She had been given a specific target, a junior officer who the resistance had identified as particularly brutal in his treatment of Dutch civilians. She approached him, started a conversation, laughed at his jokes in broken German that she had learned specifically for this purpose. Within an hour, she had convinced him to take a walk with her, away from the crowded bar, toward a park on the outskirts of the city. Other resistance members were waiting there, hidden in the darkness, armed and ready. The soldier never made it back to his barracks. When Freddie returned home that night, she ate dinner with her mother and sister. She slept in her own bed. And the next morning she woke up and prepared to do it again. The psychological toll of this work is impossible to fully comprehend from our vantage point 80 years later. Modern soldiers, trained professionals who volunteer for combat, return from war with post-traumatic stress disorder, with nightmares, with an inability to reconcile what they did in wartime with who they are as human beings. Freddie Oversteegen was 14 years old, still a child by any reasonable definition, and she was committing premeditated murder on a regular basis. She had to smile at men she intended to kill. She had to touch them, flirt with them, make them feel desired, all while knowing that in 30 minutes or an hour they would be dead, and she would be the reason why. There was no therapy available, no counseling, no support systems beyond the other resistance members who understood because they were living the same nightmare. The only way to survive psychologically was to dehumanize the enemy completely, to stop seeing the German soldiers as individuals with families and dreams and fears, and start seeing them as nothing more than targets, obstacles, problems to be eliminated. It was the same psychological mechanism the Nazis used to justify their own atrocities, and the bitter irony of that parallel was not lost on the resistance fighters who employed it. The mechanics of seduction as warfare required a specific kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with military strategy and everything to do with understanding human psychology. Freddie and her sister Truus had to become experts in reading men, in identifying which soldiers were lonely enough, drunk enough or arrogant enough to fall for their trap. Not every German soldier was a viable target. The older officers, the ones with wedding rings and photographs of children back home, were often too cautious, too aware of the risks of fraternizing with local women in occupied territory. The hardened SS troops, the true believers in Nazi ideology, were too suspicious, too well trained to let their guard down. The perfect targets were the young Wehrmacht conscripts, boys barely out of their teens who had been drafted into a war they didn't fully understand, stationed in a foreign country where everyone hated them, desperate for any human connection that didn't involve violence or fear. These were the soldiers who would see a pretty girl smiling at them in a bar and believe just for a moment that maybe the war wasn't so bad after all. These were the soldiers who would follow Freddie into the forest without question. The bars and cafes where these operations took place were scattered throughout Haarlem and Amsterdam, establishments that catered specifically to German personnel. The owners of these businesses were collaborators, Dutch citizens who had decided that profit mattered more than patriotism, who served beer and wine to the occupiers while their countrymen starved under rationing. These places had a strange atmosphere, a forced joviality that couldn't quite mask the underlying tension. German soldiers would drink and sing, trying to recreate the beer halls of Munich or Berlin, while Dutch waitresses served them with frozen smiles, counting the minutes until their shifts ended. It was into this toxic environment that Freddie would walk, a 14-year-old girl in borrowed clothes, her heart pounding, her hands sweating, knowing that one wrong word, one moment of hesitation, one flicker of fear in her eyes could expose her and get her killed. The Gestapo had informants everywhere, and if anyone suspected she was resistance, the consequences would be immediate and brutal. Torture, execution, and likely the arrest of her entire family. The approach itself was an art form that Freddie perfected through repetition and necessity. She would enter the bar casually, never looking around too obviously, never making direct eye contact with German soldiers right away. She would order a drink, usually something simple that she could nurse for an hour without actually consuming, because she needed to stay completely sober while everyone around her got drunk. She would wait, letting the soldiers notice her first, letting them make the initial approach or at least the initial eye contact. This was crucial. If she approached too directly, it would seem suspicious, too forward, too much like a trap. But if she simply existed in the space, young and pretty and apparently alone, the soldiers would come to her. They always did. The conversation would start innocuously, comments about the weather or the music or some shared observation about the bar. Freddie spoke German well enough to communicate, but with enough of an accent to seem authentically Dutch, to seem like a local girl who was perhaps curious about these foreign soldiers, perhaps even a little impressed by their uniforms and authority. The psychological game became more complex as the conversation progressed. Freddie had to gauge the soldier's level of intoxication, his personality, his susceptibility to manipulation. Some soldiers were aggressive, assuming that any Dutch girl talking to them was available for conquest. Others were gentle, almost apologetic, seeming uncomfortable with their role as occupiers. Freddie had to adapt her performance to match each individual target. With the aggressive ones, she played coy but interested, letting them think they were seducing her while she maintained just enough distance to keep them pursuing. With the gentle ones, she played vulnerable, a girl living in difficult times who just wanted to forget about the war for an evening, who saw in this German soldier not an enemy, but just another young person trying to survive. Both approaches led to the same destination. Within an hour, sometimes less, she would suggest they leave together, go somewhere quieter, somewhere they could talk without shouting over the noise of the bar. The suggestion was always framed as spontaneous, as if the idea had just occurred to her, as if she was being daring and impulsive, and the soldier, believing he had successfully charmed a local girl, would agree immediately. The walk from the bar to the killing zone was the most dangerous part of every operation. Freddie would be alone with an armed German soldier, often through streets that were patrolled by other Germans, heading toward a location that had to be isolated enough for an ambush, but not so isolated that the soldier would become suspicious. She had to maintain the performance the entire time, continuing to chat and laugh and play the role of an infatuated girl, while simultaneously calculating distances and escape routes and potential complications. If they encountered a German patrol, she had to have a story ready. If the soldier suddenly became suspicious or changed his mind, she had to be prepared to either abort the mission or handle the situation herself. The locations varied depending on where the operation was taking place. Sometimes it was a clearing in the Haarlemmerhout forest, a wooded area on the outskirts of the city where resistance members could hide easily. Sometimes it was an abandoned building, a warehouse or factory that had been damaged in the early days of the invasion and never repaired. Sometimes it was simply a dark alley or a section of canal where the sound of a gunshot would be muffled by distance and the ambient noise of the city. Wherever the location, the ending was always the same. The killing itself was never clean or cinematic, like Hollywood would later portray such moments. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final words exchanged, no moral reckoning. It was brutal, efficient, and designed to be over in seconds. When Freddie arrived at the designated location with her target, the other resistance members would already be in position, hidden in shadows or behind trees or in doorways, their weapons drawn and ready. The signal was always subtle, a specific gesture or phrase that Freddie would use to indicate that this was indeed the target, and not an innocent person caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She would step away, creating distance between herself and the soldier, and in that moment of confusion, when the German realized something was wrong but hadn't yet understood what, the shots would ring out. Center mass, just as they had been trained. The soldier would drop often without even having time to reach for his own weapon. If he survived the initial shots, if he was still moving or crying out, one of the resistance members would finish the job with a bullet to the head. And then everyone would scatter immediately, disappearing into the darkness before German patrols could respond to the sound of gunfire. But not every operation involved other resistance members waiting in ambush. Sometimes, due to scheduling conflicts or operational security concerns, Freddie had to work alone. These solo missions were exponentially more dangerous and psychologically devastating. She would lead the soldier to an isolated location, continue the flirtation until his guard was completely down, and then, when his back was turned or when he was distracted, she would pull out the small pistol she kept hidden in her coat or purse. The distance would be close, sometimes only a few feet, close enough to see the expression on his face when he realized what was about to happen, close enough to hear his final breath, close enough that his blood would sometimes splatter on her clothes, requiring her to clean up before returning to the city. Freddie never spoke publicly about the exact number of men she killed this way. In interviews given decades later, she would only say that she did what was necessary, that she had no regrets, but also that she never forgot any of their faces. Every single one stayed with her, a gallery of the dead that lived in her memory until her own death in 2015 at the age of 92. The aftermath of each killing required its own kind of tradecraft. The body couldn't be left where it fell indefinitely. Sometimes resistance members would return later to move it, to dump it in a canal or bury it in a makeshift grave, anything to delay its discovery and the inevitable German reprisals. Other times, the body was left deliberately as a message, a reminder to the occupiers that they were not safe, that even in their own bars and brothels, even when they thought they were off duty and relaxed, death could come from the most unexpected source. The Germans responded to these assassinations with predictable brutality. For every soldier killed, they would execute Dutch civilians as reprisal, usually 10 to 1, sometimes more. They would round up random people from the neighborhood where the body was found, line them up against walls and shoot them. This created a moral calculus that resistance fighters had to live with. Every successful operation meant saving potential Jewish lives or disrupting the occupation machinery, but it also meant condemning innocent Dutch civilians to execution. There was no good answer, no clean moral choice. There was only the mathematics of resistance, the grim accounting of lives saved versus lives sacrificed. Freddie's sister Truus and their friend Hannie Schaft operated using identical methods, creating a small network of teenage girls who collectively became one of the most effective resistance cells in the Netherlands. They shared intelligence, coordinated operations, and supported each other through the psychological trauma of their work. Hannie, who was slightly older and had distinctive red hair, became particularly notorious among German security forces. They called her the girl with the red hair and put a price on her head, distributing wanted posters throughout occupied Netherlands. She would eventually be captured in March of 1945, just weeks before the liberation, and executed by the SS. Her death devastated Freddie and Truus, who had come to see Hannie as more than just a fellow resistance fighter, but as a sister, someone who understood the unique horror of what they were doing because she was living it too. The three of them had created a bond that transcended normal friendship, forged in blood and secrecy, and the shared knowledge that they were committing acts that society would never fully understand or accept. The operations continued throughout 1943 and into 1944, an unrelenting campaign of seduction and assassination that claimed dozens of German lives. The exact number remains classified in Dutch military archives, too sensitive to release even 80 years after the war's end. Some historians estimate Freddie and her sister killed at least 30 German soldiers between them. Others suggest the number was much higher. What is certain is that their effectiveness caught the attention of German intelligence, who began investigating a pattern of soldiers disappearing after being seen with young Dutch women. The Gestapo increased surveillance of bars and cafes, planted informants among the Dutch population, and issued warnings to German personnel about fraternizing with locals. But the warnings were largely ignored. Young soldiers, far from home and surrounded by hostility, couldn't resist the temptation when a pretty girl smiled at them, and that fundamental human weakness, that desire for connection and intimacy, even in the midst of war, was the vulnerability that Freddie Oversteegen exploited with devastating precision. By late 1944, the war was turning decisively against Germany, but this only made the occupation of the Netherlands more brutal and desperate. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June had succeeded, Paris was liberated in August, and Allied forces were pushing toward the German border. The Dutch population, starving under increasingly harsh rationing and brutal reprisals, believed liberation was imminent. But the failed Operation Market Garden in September, the ambitious Allied attempt to capture bridges across the Netherlands and push into Germany, resulted in catastrophic defeat at Arnhem. The northern Netherlands, including Amsterdam and Haarlem, where Freddie operated, would remain under Nazi control for another 8 months. Those final months of occupation became known as the Hunger Winter, a period of mass starvation where over 20,000 Dutch civilians died from malnutrition and cold. The Germans, furious at Dutch support for the Allied operation, cut off food supplies to the western Netherlands deliberately. Rations that had already been meager became almost non-existent. People ate tulip bulbs to survive. They burned furniture for heat. And in this environment of desperation and dying, Freddie Oversteegen continued her work. The resistance operations during the Hunger Winter took on a different character, driven as much by survival as ideology. Stealing food from German warehouses became as important as killing German soldiers. Freddie and other resistance members would plan elaborate heists to acquire supplies for starving Dutch families, operations that required the same careful planning and ruthless execution as their assassination missions. But the seduction operations continued as well. Even as Freddie herself was now suffering from malnutrition, even as she was so hungry that the sight of German soldiers eating in cafes filled her with rage that had nothing to do with politics or patriotism. The soldiers she killed during this period weren't just enemies of the Netherlands or facilitators of genocide. They were also representatives of the force that was deliberately starving her country, letting children die in the streets while German personnel ate 3 meals a day. The moral calculus of killing became easier in some ways, more justified, but also more desperate. Every operation now carried additional risk because Freddie was weaker, slower, more vulnerable to mistakes caused by hunger and exhaustion. The psychological toll of operating continuously for nearly 2 years without break, without therapy, without any normal life, was creating cracks in even the most hardened resistance fighters. Freddie was 15 years old now, still technically a child, but she had killed more people than most soldiers see die in combat. She had perfected the art of seduction to the point where it was almost mechanical, a performance she could deliver even while half-starved and exhausted. But the cost was visible to those who knew her. Her mother, Truus, watched her daughter become harder, colder, more distant. The girl who had once drawn pictures and told stories had been replaced by someone who could kill without hesitation and then sit down to dinner as if nothing had happened. This was the price of resistance, the hidden cost that no monument or history book could adequately capture. The resistance didn't just fight the Nazis. It consumed the humanity of the people who fought, especially the children like Freddie, who had been forced to become soldiers before they had finished becoming people. The German security apparatus was closing in by early 1945. The Gestapo had identified several resistance cells and was conducting mass arrests throughout the Netherlands. Hannie Schaft, Freddie's red-haired friend and fellow resistance fighter, was captured on March 21, 1945, at a German checkpoint. She had false identification papers, but the Gestapo officer recognized her from wanted posters. She was taken to the dunes near Overveen, the same location where hundreds of Dutch resistance fighters and Jews had been executed throughout the war. She was forced to kneel in the sand. The first shot didn't kill her. According to witnesses, she said, "I shoot better than that," before the second shot ended her life. She was 24 years old. The news of Hannie's execution reached Freddie and Truus within days, delivered through the underground network that connected resistance cells. The grief was overwhelming, mixed with rage and fear. If Hannie could be caught, if someone that careful and experienced could be identified and executed, then no one was safe. The Oversteegen sisters went into deeper hiding, limiting their operations, preparing for the possibility that they too would be captured and killed just weeks or days before liberation finally came. But liberation, when it finally arrived in May of 1945, was not the triumphant moment that years of suffering had promised. The Netherlands was devastated, its economy destroyed, its cities damaged, its population traumatized and starving. Over 20,000 civilians had died in the hunger winter alone. Over 100,000 Dutch Jews had been murdered in the death camps. The country that emerged from occupation was fundamentally different from the one that had been invaded 5 years earlier. And for Freddie Oversteegen, now 16 years old, there was no clear path forward. She had spent her teenage years killing people. She had no education beyond what she had learned before the war. She had no job skills except assassination and subterfuge. She had trauma that wouldn't even have a name, post-traumatic stress disorder for several more decades. And she had memories that would never fade, faces of the men she had killed, the weight of the gun in her hand, the sound of bodies hitting the ground. Liberation meant the war was over, but it didn't mean the war inside her head would ever end. The liberation of the Netherlands came in stages, chaotic and uneven, beginning with the southern provinces in late 1944 and finally reaching the north in May of 1945. Canadian forces entered Haarlem on May 7th, just one day before Germany's official surrender. For most Dutch civilians, liberation meant celebration. Crowds flooding the streets, people embracing their liberators, flags appearing on every building, years of suppressed joy erupting all at once. But for resistance fighters like Freddie Oversteegen, the moment was far more complicated. There was relief, certainly, that the killing could finally stop, that she could walk the streets without constantly scanning for Gestapo agents or German patrols. But there was also a profound emptiness, a sudden absence of purpose that left her unmoored. For 2 years, every day had been structured around survival and resistance. Wake up, plan operations, execute missions, avoid capture, repeat. Now, suddenly, there was nothing. The war was over. The enemy was defeated. And Freddie was 16 years old with no idea who she was supposed to be, now that she wasn't a killer anymore. The immediate aftermath of liberation revealed horrors that even the resistance, which had witnessed atrocities throughout the occupation, hadn't fully grasped. As Allied forces pushed into Germany and began liberating concentration camps, the true scale of the Holocaust became undeniable. The families that Freddie's mother had hidden, the Jewish children they had smuggled to safety, represented a tiny fraction of those who had needed help. The vast majority, over 100,000 Dutch Jews, had been transported east and murdered in industrial killing facilities designed for maximum efficiency. When survivors began returning to the Netherlands in the summer of 1945, they came back to a country that had been complicit in their destruction, where neighbors had stolen their property, where the government bureaucracy had efficiently catalogued them for deportation. And they came back to discover that most of their families were dead. Every single person, Parents, siblings, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins wiped out. The resistance fighters who had killed German soldiers, who had thought they were fighting to save their country, had to confront the reality that they had been too few, too late, too powerless to stop the machinery of genocide. Freddie and Truus faced another complication that made their transition to peacetime even more difficult. The nature of their resistance work meant they couldn't talk about it openly, couldn't share their experiences, couldn't seek recognition or support. Dutch society in 1945 was conservative, religious, deeply uncomfortable with women who had violated traditional gender roles, let alone women who had used sexuality as a weapon and committed premeditated murder. Male resistance fighters were celebrated as heroes, given medals and pensions and honored in ceremonies. But female fighters, especially those who had used seduction tactics, were viewed with suspicion and moral judgment. There were whispers that they had been collaborators, that they had slept with Germans willingly, that their claims of resistance work were lies to cover shameful behavior. The Dutch government classified most of their operations, sealed the records, and essentially erased their contributions from the official narrative of the resistance. Freddie and Truus were told, explicitly and implicitly, that their service had been valuable, but that it would be better for everyone if they simply went back to being normal Dutch girls and never spoke about what they had done. But becoming normal was impossible when nothing about their experience had been normal. Freddie tried to build a conventional life in the years following the war. She got married, had children, worked various jobs, attempted to integrate into a society that had no framework for understanding what she had endured. But the trauma was always there, manifesting in ways that 1940s and 1950s psychiatry had no tools to address. Nightmares that never stopped, hypervigilance that made normal social situations exhausting, an inability to trust authority or feel safe in crowds, sudden rage at injustice or cruelty that seemed disproportionate to others but felt completely justified to her. The faces of the men she had killed appeared in her dreams, not as accusers but as witnesses, silent reminders of what she had been forced to become. She couldn't explain this to her husband or her children. She couldn't explain it to friends or co-workers. The few times she tried to hint at her wartime experiences, people either didn't believe her or changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with the implications of a woman who had killed men using seduction. For decades, Freddie Oversteegen lived in this silence, her story buried along with thousands of other resistance narratives that didn't fit the heroic mythology the Netherlands wanted to tell about itself. The official history celebrated male fighters, the ones who blew up bridges and ambushed German patrols in dramatic firefights. It celebrated the few who helped hide Jews, like the family that sheltered Anne Frank, creating simplified narratives of good versus evil that Dutch society could process and commemorate. But it had no place for girls who had used their bodies as weapons, who had flirted with soldiers and then shot them in the back of the head, who had survived by becoming exactly the kind of cold-blooded killers that society condemned. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s, when feminist historians began investigating women's roles in the resistance, that Freddie's story started to emerge from the classified files and sealed memories. Even then, the Netherlands struggled with how to honor her. Was she a hero or a cautionary tale? Was she a victim of circumstance or an agent of her own destiny? Could a country celebrate someone who had committed acts that, in any other context, would be considered murder? The first time Freddie Oversteegen publicly acknowledged her wartime activities was in 2014, nearly 70 years after the liberation of the Netherlands. She was 85 years old, living quietly in a small town, when a Dutch journalist finally convinced her to tell her story on camera. The interview, conducted in her modest living room surrounded by photographs of her children and grandchildren, revealed a woman who had carried an impossible weight for 7 decades. She spoke calmly, without dramatics, describing her missions with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting a job they had performed long ago. She confirmed that yes, she had seduced German soldiers. Yes, she had led them to their deaths. Yes, she had sometimes pulled the trigger herself. And no, she had no regrets about the Germans she killed. Her only regret, she said, was Hannie Schaft, her red-haired friend who had been executed just 3 weeks before liberation. That was the death that haunted her, the one that felt preventable, the loss that still brought tears to her eyes 70 years later. The interview went viral in the Netherlands and then globally, sparking intense debate about wartime morality, about child soldiers, about the role of women in resistance movements, and about why this story had been hidden for so long. The public reaction to Freddie's revelations split along predictable lines. Historians and feminists celebrated her bravery, arguing that she represented thousands of women whose contributions to the resistance had been erased or minimized because their methods didn't conform to masculine notions of heroism. They pointed out that male resistance fighters who killed Germans were honored without question, but women who did the same thing using different tactics were judged by different standards. Veterans organizations and conservative commentators were more ambivalent, uncomfortable with celebrating what they saw as deception and betrayal, even when directed at enemies. Some questioned whether the missions had even happened, suggesting Freddie was exaggerating or fabricating her role, despite the existence of classified government files that confirmed her service. Others argued that while her actions may have been necessary during wartime, they weren't something to celebrate or promote, especially to young people. The debate revealed how deeply uncomfortable modern society remains with women who use sexuality as a weapon and with violence committed by children, even when that violence was directed at Nazis. What the public debate often missed was the human cost buried beneath the historical significance. Freddie's interview was revealing not just because of what she had done, but because of what it had cost her. She described decades of nightmares, of jumping at sudden noises, of being unable to form close relationships because trust had been weaponized in her teenage years. She talked about the guilt that came not from killing Germans, but from surviving when Hannie and so many others hadn't. She spoke about the isolation of carrying secrets for 70 years, of watching her country celebrate male resistance fighters while she remained silent about her own service. She described the peculiar torture of seeing World War II portrayed in films and books as a story of soldiers and battles, while the quiet, intimate violence she had committed, the assassinations disguised as seduction, remained invisible in the cultural narrative. The interview was an unburdening, a final attempt to set the record straight before death claimed her story forever. The Dutch government, embarrassed by the revelation that they had essentially hidden female resistance fighters from history, began a slow process of acknowledgement. In 2014, Freddie and her sister Truus were finally awarded the Mobilization War Cross, a military decoration for their service during the occupation. The ceremony was small, almost apologetic, a recognition that came 7 decades too late for most of the women who had served alongside them. Many had already died, their stories lost, their service unrecorded in any official capacity. The government also began the process of declassifying some resistance records, though many files remain sealed even today, too sensitive to release because they reveal the full extent of operations that society still isn't ready to acknowledge. The partial declassification confirmed what Freddie had claimed. She and her sister had been among the most effective resistance fighters in the Netherlands, with a documented body count that exceeded most male operatives. The files also revealed something even more disturbing. They weren't the only teenage girls doing this work. There had been others, scattered across occupied Europe, using the same tactics, dying in the same obscurity. By the time Freddie gave her interview, she had made peace with her past in the only way possible for someone who had lived such an impossible life. She didn't apologize for what she had done. She didn't claim it was heroic. She simply stated that it was necessary, that given the same circumstances, she would make the same choices again. The Germans were committing genocide. The resistance needed fighters who could get close to the enemy. She was one of the few people who could do that job, so she did it. The moral complexity of using a 14-year-old girl as an assassin, of teaching a child to seduce and kill, was a problem for philosophers and historians to debate. For Freddie, it was simply what happened, what the war demanded, what she survived. And now, finally, after 70 years of silence, people would know. The girl who seduced Nazis in bars and led them to their deaths in the forest would no longer be a footnote in classified files. She would be remembered, complicated and controversial, and absolutely unforgettable. Freddie Oversteegen died on September 5, 2018, at the age of 92, in a care facility in the Netherlands. Her death made international headlines, something that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier, when her story was still buried in classified files. Obituaries appeared in major newspapers across Europe and North America, each trying to capture the impossible contradiction of her life. A woman who had been a child assassin, who had killed dozens of men using seduction as her weapon, who had lived quietly for 70 years before finally revealing the truth. The BBC called her one of the last living members of the Dutch resistance who used unconventional tactics. The New York Times described her as a teenage resistance fighter who seduced and killed Nazis. But no headline could truly capture what it meant to be Freddie Oversteegen, to carry that history, to live with those memories, to reconcile the girl who drew pictures with the girl who pulled triggers. Her funeral was attended by Dutch government officials, resistance historians, and veterans who had served in different capacities but understood the weight of wartime trauma. They honored her not just for what she did, but for surviving it, for carrying the burden so others didn't have to. Her sister Truus had died 2 years earlier, in 2016 at the age of 92, taking her own version of the same story to the grave. The two sisters had remained close throughout their lives, bound by experiences that no one else could fully understand. They rarely discussed their wartime activities, even with each other, because some memories were too heavy to revisit casually. But they had an unspoken understanding, a shared knowledge of what they had sacrificed and what had been taken from them. When Truus died, Freddie lost the last person who truly knew what it had been like to be a teenage girl killing grown men, to be praised as a hero while being judged as a woman who had used her sexuality in ways society found uncomfortable. The loneliness of that final 2 years, being the last keeper of a story that had finally been told but never fully understood, must have been profound. Freddie had outlived not just her sister and most of her fellow resistance fighters, but also the world that had created them. The circumstances that had made child assassins seem not just acceptable, but necessary. The legacy of Freddie Oversteegen and her sister remains deeply contested, even now 6 years after her death. In the Netherlands, they are increasingly recognized as national heroes, with memorials, documentary films, and educational programs dedicated to ensuring their stories aren't forgotten again. A statue was proposed, then debated, then ultimately approved, though the design itself became controversial. How do you memorialize someone whose heroism involved deception and killing? Do you show her with a gun? Do you show her smiling, the way she smiled at the soldiers she intended to kill? Do you show her as the child she was, or the soldier she became? The final design, unveiled in 2022, shows Freddie and Truus as teenagers on bicycles, the way they would have looked traveling to and from their missions. It's deliberately ambiguous, allowing viewers to see either innocent girls or deadly operatives depending on their perspective. The ambiguity is intentional, a recognition that there is no simple way to honor what these girls did and what was done to them. Outside the Netherlands, Freddie's story has been absorbed into the broader narrative of World War II resistance movements, often simplified or sanitized for popular consumption. She appears in articles about badass women of history and unknown heroes of World War II, reduced to a single dramatic fact: the teenage girl who killed Nazis. These retellings often strip away the complexity, the trauma, the moral ambiguity, leaving only the shocking hook that drives clicks and views. They rarely mention the nightmares that lasted 70 years, the relationships she struggled to maintain, the decades of silence and isolation. They celebrate the killing without acknowledging the cost, turning Freddie into a symbol rather than a person. This is perhaps inevitable. History prefers clean narratives, heroes without complications, actions without consequences. But Freddie herself, in that final interview before her death, resisted this simplification. She insisted that people understand the full reality of what she did and what it took from her. She wanted to be remembered, yes, but remembered accurately as someone who did terrible things for necessary reasons and paid a price that never stopped accumulating. The question her story forces us to confront is not whether what she did was right or wrong in some abstract moral sense. The question is, what kind of circumstances create a world where 14-year-old girls become assassins, where children are forced to make life and death decisions that trained soldiers struggle with, where survival requires the weaponization of innocence itself? The Nazis created those circumstances through their occupation, their genocide, their systematic destruction of normal society. The resistance responded with the only weapons available, including teenage girls who could move freely where men couldn't, who could exploit the enemy's assumptions and desires. Freddie didn't choose to be a killer any more than she chose to live through the Holocaust or the Hunger Winter. She chose to fight back using the only advantage she had, and that choice saved lives, disrupted the occupation, and contributed in some small way to the eventual liberation of her country. But it also destroyed something essential in her, something that could never be recovered or repaired. She was both hero and victim, both agent and casualty, both the girl on the bicycle and the assassin in the forest. And 7 decades of silence couldn't change the fact that she was, above all, a survivor of a war that never truly ended for her. The story of Freddie Oversteegen forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about war, resistance, and the stories we choose to remember. For 70 years, her contributions were classified, buried in government archives, deemed too controversial for public consumption. This wasn't an accident or oversight. It was a deliberate choice by a society that wanted to celebrate its resistance to Nazi occupation, but only in ways that confirmed existing moral frameworks. Male fighters who ambushed German patrols or sabotaged railways fit neatly into traditional narratives of heroism. But teenage girls who used seduction and assassination, who weaponized femininity itself, who killed men at close range after making them believe they were desired, that story was too complicated, too morally ambiguous, too threatening to post-war gender norms. So it was erased. The women who fought this way were thanked quietly, given small pensions, and told to resume normal lives as if they had spent the occupation knitting socks rather than killing soldiers. The erasure wasn't just about protecting the women. It was about protecting a national myth that couldn't accommodate the reality of what resistance actually required. This pattern of erasure extends far beyond the Netherlands and far beyond World War II. Throughout history, women who participated in resistance movements, revolutions, and wars have been systematically written out of official narratives or reduced to supporting roles. When their contributions are acknowledged, they're often sanitized, focusing on nursing or communications rather than combat or assassination. The uncomfortable reality is that women have always fought in wars, often using tactics that male soldiers couldn't or wouldn't employ, and their effectiveness has been consistently minimized or hidden because it threatens fundamental assumptions about gender, violence, and power. Freddie Oversteegen's story is exceptional, not because she was unique, but because she finally managed to tell it before she died, because journalists and historians in the 21st century were finally willing to listen, and because society had evolved just enough to begin grappling with the complexity of what she represented. But for every Freddie whose story eventually emerged, there are hundreds or thousands of women whose resistance work died with them, classified forever, erased from history. The broader lesson of Freddie's story isn't about the specific tactics of resistance, or even about World War II specifically. It's about what happens to societies when normal moral frameworks collapse, when the choice becomes collaboration or resistance, when survival requires ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. The Holocaust was an industrial genocide, a bureaucratic operation that required the participation or acquiescence of millions of people. Stopping it, or even slowing it, required a willingness to kill the perpetrators. That moral calculus is straightforward in the abstract. Killing Nazis who were facilitating genocide was justified. But when you zoom in to the individual level, when you see a 14-year-old girl pulling a trigger, when you watch her smile at a young German soldier who might have been a conscript rather than a volunteer, who might have had doubts about the war, who might have been no more evil than circumstance made him, the moral clarity starts to blur. Freddie understood this complexity. She never claimed her victims were all monsters. She simply said they were the enemy, and in war you kill the enemy. The fact that she was a child, that she used seduction, that she killed at close range, those details don't change the fundamental nature of what she did. They just make us more uncomfortable with it. Today, Freddie Oversteegen's story has finally entered the cultural conversation, appearing in books, documentaries, articles, and even discussions about potential film adaptations. But there's a risk that in becoming famous, her story will be hollowed out, turned into entertainment rather than history, consumed as a thrilling tale of teenage resistance fighters without grappling with the trauma and moral complexity that made the story important in the first place. Hollywood loves stories about attractive young women killing Nazis. It's a fantasy that allows audiences to enjoy violence without guilt, because the targets are universally recognized as evil. But Freddie's story isn't a fantasy. It's a tragedy. It's the story of children forced to become killers because adults had failed to prevent genocide. It's the story of a girl who survived the war but never escaped it, who carried the faces of dead men in her memory for 92 years, who was honored as a hero 7 decades too late to matter. The real lesson isn't that she was brave or clever or effective, though she was all those things. The real lesson is that we created a world where her bravery was necessary, and then we tried to forget about it because remembering was too uncomfortable. The forests outside Harlem are peaceful now, popular with hikers and cyclists, completely ordinary, except for small memorials marking execution sites where the resistance killed collaborators and Germans. Most people who walk through those woods have no idea what happened there 80 years ago. No sense of the blood that soaked into that soil, no awareness that teenage girls once led men to their deaths under those trees. Freddie Oversteegen is gone now, along with her sister and almost everyone who knew the truth firsthand. Within another generation, there will be no living witnesses left, no one who can describe what it actually felt like to live through the occupation, to make impossible choices, to kill and survive and carry that weight for a lifetime. Her story will become history, then legend, then eventually a footnote that most people skip over. But for now, for this brief moment before living memory fades completely, we have the chance to understand what really happened. Not the sanitized version, not the heroic myth, not the comfortable narrative that lets us sleep well at night. The real story. The story of a 14-year-old girl who seduced Nazi soldiers in bars and led them to their deaths in the forest, who did what she believed was necessary to fight genocide, and who paid a price that 70 years of peace could never fully repay. That's the story that deserves to be remembered in all its terrible, complicated, unforgettable truth.